Okay, so when it comes to treating ADHD, one of the most common ways to treat it is with stimulant medications such as Ritalin and Adderall. There are risks associated with this. Whenever you introduce any type of chemical into the brain, there's going to be risks. And, it may not be enough to help, completely with the ADHD. In fact, it won't be enough to, get rid of the ADHD. Family intervention is needed. The whole family needs to be involved in this, and the child needs to learn skills for dealing with his ADHD, his or her ADHD, and how to control their own behavior, and that they have this, but it doesn't define who they are. Adults that have ADHD are going to continue to need assistance. They may need to continue to have stimulant medications. Some people don't get diagnosed until they are adults, but for the most part, a child with ADHD, the ADHD gets less severe over time and sometimes can resolve itself. Intelligence tests at this age can be given and be pretty reliable. Group tests are more like tests that are given at school, and it's not necessarily an intelligence test. They're usually more tests to see if you are going to be good at something later on. So being able to administer to a group is nice because you can do a lot of people at once. It requires very little training for the person to administrate it. It is useful for instructional planning. So we can look at these tests, these group tests, and say, okay, these are the kids who can be in gifted and talented program. These are the kids who, may need a little bit of extra help. You also, from a group test, might identify a student who could use individual testing. So if a child just goes like way off the charts on a group test, then we may do a true intelligence test on them to see where they're at. Or if a child does really badly on a group test, we may need to also do a individual intelligence test on them. A true intelligence test needs to be administered by someone who has training in doing intelligence tests. And this is almost always a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And they're going to be able to provide insights about the score that they get, how accurate it is, what it says about your child when you find out their IQ. It can help identify those highly intelligent children and children with learning problems, so that we can say, okay, do we want to move this kid above a grade? Do we want to put them into a special program? Do we, maybe want to find a different school for this child? For the most part, though, most people won't ever have a real intelligence test done because it's not that important. You don't really need to know what your IQ is. And it takes a really long time. Intelligence tests take hours and hours and hours, and they are very expensive as well. So this is a typical intelligence test type questions. So it'd have questions like, tell me what carpet means. Now everyone can answer these questions, and an IQ test isn't supposed to be especially hard. Everyone should be able to answer the questions. What we're looking for is how quickly do you answer the questions, how thoroughly do you answer the questions, and kind of the thinking behind your answers. So on a question like, tell me what carpet means, even a 4-year-old can answer that question. But carpet can be the noun, it can be the thing that's on the floor of your house, but carpet can also be used as a verb, like to carpet the, area with flowers. So they'd be looking at things like that. Then we look at, like arithmetic. If a $60 jacket is 25% off, how much does this cost? Pretty much anyone who has a basic understanding of math can answer that question, but people with high IQs can answer it very quickly. Then we have spatial reasoning type things. Here's a bunch of blocks, put them so that looks like this, like make this picture. Digit span, they'll read out 264718 and then say, now read that back to me. And so they would have to remember 817462. So all of these things are, again, they can be difficult, but they're not really hard. Everyone should be able to do it. But the people that, show high IQs do all of these things very, very quickly. They process the information very quickly. So, Sternberg has this triarchy theory of successful intelligence. Sternberg likes to do things in triangles. We'll see him again when we get to intimacy. So he said that successful intelligence, or intelligence that you can actually use and be successful in life, is made up of three parts: analytical intelligence, practical intelligence, and creative intelligence. Analytical intelligence um, is, can you acquire knowledge? Can you read a book and understand what you've read? An analytical intelligence has a lot to do with school smarts. Practical intelligence is, can you adapt to new situations? Do you select environments that are best for your goals and for who you are? So it's more like street smarts. And then creative intelligence is, how do you solve problems? Do you come up with new novel ways to solve problems? Um, can you free up your working memory to do more complex thinking? So people who are high on all of these, he said, would have high successful intelligence. So we know that genetics plays a role in IQ. We don't know how big of a role, but it's probably pretty big. Adoption studies do show that there's an influence of both the environment and genetics on your IQ. What we know is that you're probably, or what our best guess is right now, is that genetics probably gives you an IQ span of some sort. So your genetics is going to say, okay, your IQ is going to fall somewhere between 100 and 110. So no matter what, no matter what kind of schools you go to, no matter your nutrition, like no matter, how many books you have in the house, your IQ won't ever really be lower than 100 without some sort of like disease or head trauma. And it's never going to be over 110, like no matter what kind of interventions are put. However, where you fall in the spectrum between 100 and 110 depends on your environment. So a child that has a very enriched environment with good schools and good nutrition is going to have an IQ that falls higher, closer to the 110, where the same child, if he were put in a deprived environment without the good schools, without the good nutrition, his IQ would then be closer to 100. So genetics kind of lays the framework, and environment decides kind of where you fall within what genetics gives you. So our language development at this age, we want to have a lot of vocabulary. Uh, Eventually, around the end of high school, we want to see about 40,000 words that are readily available in a child's vocabulary. This is always very highly tied to reading. So we have seen that as children have been reading less and less and less, their vocabulary has gone down over the past couple of decades. The more a child learns, the more vocabulary they know, the more vocabulary they use. Their grammar at this age, they can master more complex constructions, they can understand, future, past, present, all that sort of stuff. Uh, and then they also understand pragmatics, so they can adjust the way they use language to the people and the situations that they're in. They also learn to like phrase requests to get what they want. If I'm asking mom something, I'm going to ask it differently than when I'm asking it from dad, because I know how to get things from mom differently from dad. They're also learning that, I talk to grandma differently than I talk to my friends, which is different than how I talk to my teacher. So they're kind of picking up on all those little nuances in language right now. Bilingual development is when you learn two languages at the same time, or when you learn one language and then learn a second language afterwards. There is a sensitive period for language development in the first few years of life, up until about age 7 to 8. It's the best time for us to pick up language. The reason being that a different part of our brain processes language after the age of about 7 or 8 than it does when we're a kid, a little kid. People who learn a language after the age of 7 or 8 are always going to be translating the words of the second language into the first language in their brain, while as kids who learn the language before 7 or 8 don't translate. It's just kind of an integral part. They just automatically understand it. So when it comes to bilingual education, there's two programs that work really well. Bilingual education as uh, a thing is when children are taught all day long in two separate languages. So every day, all day long, they're taught in, let's say, both English and Spanish. So the whole class is taught, whether they're non-English speakers or not, they're taught in English and Spanish, every subject. Um, Bilingual education, we know, actually works really well because the non-English speaking children learn English, the English speaking children learn Spanish or whatever other language. So both children are learning multiple languages at once, and all the children tend to do much better. So when we study bilingual programs, we see that those kids do better across the board in all subjects. Like they excel academically a lot more than children who aren't in bilingual education. And when we look at industrialized countries outside the United States, especially in Europe, they start their bilingual education with those kids in kindergarten. Very early on, they're taught multiple languages from the beginning of their schooling. In most parts of the United States, bilingual education is actually illegal. You are not allowed to use bilingual education in the schools. You usually have to go and get special paperwork from the school district to be able to have a bilingual even classroom. Um, because people say like, oh, I don't want my kid being taught in a language that they don't speak and blah blah blah, even though we know it works really well and it's been shown to work really well in other industrialized countries. What we have mostly here in America are ESL programs, English as a second language, where the kid is in the regular classroom for part of the day and they're taken out for English instruction for the other part of the day. This works well, and it works better than just full English immersion. Just taking kids who don't speak English and throwing them into school without any help just causes them to fall further and further behind, and then they're at a higher likelihood of dropping out of school. If you are interested in bilingual education for your child, the really only options around here and in most parts of the United States are to send your child to an international school or a private school. International schools like the ones we have in Dallas, most of them have bilingual education where the children are taught English, French, and Spanish. One day all of the classes are in English. The next day all of the classes are in Spanish. The next day all the classes are in French, and they rotate through, week by week, different days being taught in different languages. And they started in kindergarten, so that the kids become fluent in 3 languages as they move through. But you also have to be prepared to be spending, $10,000 to $20,000 a year on the tuition for your kid to go to those schools. All right, so high quality elementary education, what we want to see is class sizes being small. We don't want the teacher being overwhelmed with 30 or 40 kids in the classroom, which unfortunately there is a lot of that here in the United States. The physical setting needs to be, open. Like this classroom here looks pretty awesome. I wish I went to school here. Right? The kids, have an ability to work together. It's bright, it's colorful. There's, lots of tools for them. The curriculum needs to be engaging to the student. There needs to be a lot of teacher-student interactions. We want the teacher, to know each one of her students to help, build that zone of proximal development. There should be a good evaluation of the progress, seeing are the children moving forward, are they learning, which kids are maybe moving faster than others and giving them more challenging work, which kids are maybe falling a little bit behind, they need to have a little more time spent with them. And high quality elementary schools also have good relationships with the parents and the families. The parents are encouraged to come to the school. The teacher has good communication with the parents. So the parents know, like, what are my kids learning? What's going on? They have input. That's, really important. It also, when the kids see their parents being involved in their education, it also helps the kids see that, they're important. Children with learning difficulties include anything from mild mental retardation, literally low IQ, um, all the way through all the other types of learning disabilities like dyslexia and sensory disorders. The law requires a least restrictive environment, which means that keeping them in the mainstream classroom as much as possible, maybe with an aide. Children with learning difficulties will have an individual education plan set with the school district that kind of outlines, what the child needs and getting them, their needs met in the least restrictive way. convergent and divergent thinking being taught in school. Convergent thinking is just get to the right answer. Divergent thinking is can you come up with many different solutions? We tend to focus on convergent thinking in most classes, but divergent thinking is really what's looked for in the job market, and it relates to more creative thinking. So we do want to try and encourage more divergent thinking.